What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we're looking at the totally shocking round number 8 game of the World Chess Championships between Ding Liren of China and Gukesh D of India. So let's dive right in. Alright, in the game, Ding Liren is playing as white. Now, so far in this match, he has opened one e4, one knight f3, and one d4. Now, in this game, he does open one c4, the English opening, so Ding Liren mixing it up. Now here, Gukesh, as black, he does go one e5. That is the main line. This is the King's English or the reverse Sicilian, whatever you want to call it. Now here, Ding Liren, the main moves for white are knight to c3 and g3, intending bishop g2. In the game, he does go knight to c3. That is perfectly playable. And here, Gukesh, the main line for black, of course, is knight f6. From there, the main line goes knight f3, knight c6, and then white has a choice of ideas like e3 and g3. However, instead, in this position, Gukesh, he plays a sideline. That is the move bishop b4, putting immediate pressure on that knight on c3. Now, this move is sometimes played at the highest level. However, overall, it is thought to be a little bit weaker than the alternative knight to f3. And here, Ding Liren plays the strongest move as white. That is simply knight d5, jumping up with the knight and threatening the bishop. Now, of course, that bishop is undefended. Black's going to have to find some way to defend it. And now the three main lines for black in this position are a5, bishop c5, and bishop to e7. But which one does Gukesh want to play in the game? Well, he does go bishop e7. This move surprised me. This move is a little bit more passive. It's very solid. Black is intending moves like knight f6, d6, short castles, and so on. However, Gukesh is a very active player. I expected either a5 or bishop c5 on the prior move. Now here, Ding, how does he want to proceed? Well, technically, he has the option of trading on e7, knight takes e7. However, that is going to be an option he's always going to have. There's no need to play it right away. So with that in mind, what is Ding's move going to be? Well, the strongest move here, believe it or not, is just d4. The point being, after e takes, queen takes, black is not going to have time for the move knight to c6, as that pawn on g7 will be hanging. Therefore, queen takes g7 will be a move. So d4 overall, a very strong move in this position. But instead, Ding, he does go knight to f3, putting pressure on that pawn on e5. Now, of course, Gukesh is going to have to defend. There are many different moves you can play here. For example, d6 defending the pawn, e4 putting pressure on the knight, even moves like c6 putting pressure on the knight on d5, or knight to c6 defending the pawn are playable. In the game, Gukesh does go d6. That is arguably the most solid move in that position. Gukesh so far trying to play very solid as black. Now Ding, how does he want to proceed? There are several different pawn breaks you can play here. For example, g3 intending bishop g2, e3 intending d4. The immediate d4 is playable, and beyond that, you can also go d3 intending e4 on the next move with a light square pawn structure. Now, in the game, Ding does go g3, intending bishop g2 with that Catalan-style bishop on the g2 square. Now, Gukesh, in this position, how does he want to proceed? Again, there are a million different lines here as black. In the game, he does go c6, putting immediate pressure on that knight on d5. Now, of course, knight takes e7 is the main move here for white, and that is what's played in the game. Knight takes e7, and now Gukesh, he has the option of taking with the queen or the knight. He does take with the knight. Knight takes e7, an interesting choice. And now Ding Liren, bishop g2. And now, this is where things get very spicy. Here, Gukesh, I expected just short castles. There is nothing wrong with that move at all. However, instead, he played Ben Finegold's signature move as black. And yes, that's right, Chess YouTube. In this position, Gukesh did play the move f6. Ben Finegold says never play f6 under any circumstances. But here, Gukesh, he does not abide by Ben Finegold's golden rule. He plays the move f6. The point being, he wants to support his pawn structure on e5. Now here we have castles, and then bishop e6 for Gukesh. Delaying short castles, a very interesting move. And now, of course, that light squared bishop is very important for Gukesh's position. It does cover all of these weakened light squares in the center and on the king side. Now, Ding Liren, how does he want to proceed? Well, in the game, he does go b3, an interesting move, potentially intending bishop b2 or even bishop a3. I mean, we saw him go bishop a3 in his second game as white, where he did open knight f3, then b3, and then bishop a3, putting pressure on this diagonal. We'll have to wait and see if that is what he does in the game here. All right, Gukesh, he goes d5, and now we have a very unusual pawn structure at the highest level. This is sort of a beginner pawn structure. If a beginner played chess, he'd be like, oh yeah, I'm going to grab the center, I'm going to bolster my center with those pawns. It's going to be great. It's going to be awesome. But You never see top grandmasters do this as black, especially with the move f6 included. It looks very artificial, very beginner-like, but surprisingly, Ding Liren doesn't have a good way to attack the center, and here Gukesh has already equalized as black out of the opening. Alright, Ding, how does he want to proceed? Well, the main ideas here, of course, are bishop b2 and bishop a3. Which diagonal does Ding want that bishop on? Well, it turns out he does want it on a3. Bishop a3, putting pressure on that knight, and the bishop actually is very active on this diagonal. Very importantly, if it went to b2, that bishop would be biting on granite. That pawn on e5 is just perfectly bolstered. That bishop would not be doing anything. So overall, a3 looks to be a better diagonal for the bishop. All right, Gukesh, he finally does castle on the king side. Short castles is the move. Now Ding, rook to c1, and here Gukesh, he's got to find the right way to continue developing. He's got a very powerful pawn center. His pawn on d5 is defended, but how does he want to get his queenside pieces into the game? Specifically, the queen, the knight, and the rook. Well, he's got a few different moves here. One option is just rook e8 immediately, getting the rook off this diagonal and unpinning the knight. That also frees up the queen to go somewhere else if it wants to move. Beyond that, black can also go for moves like knight a6, queen d7, a5, and so on. In the game, Gukesh does go a5. As they say, at the super grandmaster level, when in doubt, you just push your rook pawns down the board. Now, I'm joking when I say that, but surprisingly, a lot of grandmasters basically do abide by that rule. I mean, top grandmasters these days are always gaining space with the rook pawns on a5, h5, a4, and h4. All right, Ding Liren. In this position, the computer finds the absurd idea of going knight to h4, intending f2 to f4, gaining space on the king side, and then the pawn structure in the center really would be insane. The pawns on c4 and f4, the pawns on c6, d5, e5, and f6 for black. Now, instead of that, Ding does go knight to e1, and this is a multi-purpose move. First of all, again, you are threatening f4 with the very absurd pawn structure for both sides. Now, beyond that, that knight may go to, say, c2 and e3 later in the game. That is a relatively common idea in the English opening. We'll have to wait and see if that is what Ding has in mind. All right, here, Gukesh, rook to e8, a very solid move, as discussed, getting the rook out of, the knight out of this pin to the rook on f8. The rook does support the knight, and now the queen is free to move to, say, I don't know, b6 later in the game if required, as that knight will be defended. So rook e8, very solid move, and Gukesh is doing excellent so far in this game. He might even have a tiny advantage so far. All right, now Ding. He shows the idea of knight to e1 on the prior move, and yes, that's right, he does push the f-pawn, f4, and now let's just slow down and appreciate this pawn structure. I mean, white, with the symmetrical double fianchetto c4, f4 sort of setup, and black with this absurd pawn structure in the center. I mean, I'm not sure I've ever seen this exact pawn structure at the highest level, let alone a world championship match. I mean, this is just comical at the highest level. All right, Gukesh, in this position, what should he be doing? Well, first of all, the threat by Ding is simply trading on e5, f takes, then going knight to f3, threatening ideas like knight g5, and white would have a lot of activity with the rook on the open f-file, the knight on g5, and so on. So Gukesh, he does have to respond to that threat. But what's it going to be? Well, the two best ways to respond are e takes f4 and e4. In the game, Gukesh does take on f4 with the pawn. E takes f4 is the move, and now Ding Liren, he takes with the rook. Rook takes f4. All right, very interesting. Now Gukesh, he actually trades on c4 as well. D takes c4, and then of course, as the bishop is pressuring that pawn on c4, B takes c4 is the only good response. You can't recapture with the rook, as then black takes the rook on c4. Therefore, B takes c4 is the move. All right, Gukesh, knight g6, finally getting his knight to a better square. Again, we're seeing the point of rook e8 earlier, getting that rook out of the pin of the bishop on a3, and surprisingly, the bishop on a3 is still quite active. All right, now, the knight on g6 does pressure the rook of white on f4. The rook's got to move, and now, most beginners would say, all right, the rook's under attack. You know, keeping the rook in the center of the board is not the best idea. Therefore, I'm going to go back to, say, f3, f2, or f1. If you're a beginner, that is the general right thought process. However, in this specific position, the rook actually does belong on the e4 square. It looks absurd, but this is the best move, and it's the move Ding Liren played in the game. We have rook e4 on the board, and now, I mean, the game is getting crazier and crazier with every move. All right, Gukesh. In this position, the computer wants him to go f5, then f4, gaining space on the king side and pressuring the rook. Instead, knight to a6 is the move. Not a bad move by any stretch of the imagination. And now the knight is eyeing the b4 square. And also, very importantly, it does free up the rook on a8 to enter into the game. All right, now, Ding Liren, knight to c2. We're seeing the other idea of knight e1 played earlier in the game. Now the knight has access to both d4 and e3. We'll have to wait and see where the knight's going to go. And now, Gukesh. In this position, he does have a relatively small but stable advantage. He's got better central control, but he's got to find the right way to follow up. In the game, he starts queen to c7. Not a bad move, perhaps intending rook a d8. Now, Ding, he's got two squares for the knight, knight d4 and knight to e3. Bringing his knight into the game is basically the highest priority here. In the game, he does go knight to d4, jumping up with the knight. And now, of course, the rook on e4 no longer defends c4, but now the rook on c1 defends the pawn. Therefore, bishop takes c4, again, is not possible yet. All right, Gukesh, bishop f7 is the move. The bishop was under attack, therefore retreating is a good idea. Now here, Ding. He's got the option of trading on e8. Rook takes e8 is playable. For example, the computer likes the idea of rook takes, then knight to f5, jumping up with the knight, eyeing a lot of these weakened light squares on the king side. However, instead, he does start with the move d3, just bolstering his pawn on the c4 square. And again, this pawn structure is just getting weirder and weirder. All right, Gukesh, he jumps in with the knight, knight to e5. e5 is a fantastic square for the knight. It's almost impossible to dislodge it. I mean, for example, the knight on d4 likely doesn't want to go to f3, but beyond that, the only other piece that can challenge it really is the bishop, and the bishop is very far away from getting pressure on e5. So the knight on e5 is going to be very stable for a long while. All right, now, in this position, how does Ding Liren want to proceed? Well, the strongest move here is just queen d2, a solid developing move, but instead he does retreat the knight, knight to f3, putting pressure on the knight on e5. He is not happy about that knight, Ding Liren trying to get rid of it at all costs. Now here, Gukesh has a variety of ways to proceed. He can take on f3, he can retreat, and he can also go, say, bishop g6, putting pressure on the rook, that being perhaps the strongest idea according to the computer. Now here, Gukesh, knight d7 is the move, jumping back with the knight, but this turns out to be a little bit dubious. Instead, bishop g6 and knight takes f3 were the stronger ideas, and this is probably the first real mistake of Gukesh in this game. And here, Ding Liren, if he follows up precisely, he may be fighting for a small advantage here. All right, he starts rook takes e8, then rook takes, and now Ding. He's got to find that queen d2 move once again. He doesn't find it. Instead, rook to b1 is the move. Not a bad idea in principle. The rook not doing a whole lot on the c-file, is defending an already defended pawn, and now on b1, it does put pressure on b7. So again, not a bad idea in principle, but here Gukesh, he finds a brilliant move. That is the move b5, immediately expanding on the queen side. Now, very importantly, is this a pawn sacrifice? After all, this pawn on b5 is being attacked twice by the pawn on c4 and the rook on b1. Meanwhile, it's only defended once by the pawn on c6. Well, it turns out the answer is no, it is not a pawn sacrifice. There is a tactical way to defend the pawn. Now here, Ding, he does take on b5, c takes b5, but now Gukesh, he has the tactical shot, queen to b6 check, hitting the king on g1, but also bolstering the b5 square. Now the king moves, king to f1, and then c takes b5. Now, of course, that pawn on b5 is defended by the queen on b6. All right, Ding here in this position. Again, he's got to think about centralizing his pieces. For example, queen c2 may be good, even bishop h3, putting pressure on that knight on d7. Instead, the move is bishop b2. Now, this looks good in principle. Black was threatening b4, trying to entomb that bishop on a3. So, bishop b2, not a bad idea in principle. But the problem with this move is it does hang that pawn on the a2 square. Queen c2 was necessary to defend, or bishop h3, putting pressure on the knight, gaining a tempo. Now here, Gukesh, he simply takes the free pawn. Bishop takes a2, and now Gukesh, he's up a pawn. He has two connected pass pawns on the queen side. I mean, he's got simply a massive advantage in this position. All right, Ding Liren, bishop d4, putting pressure on the queen. Where is the queen going to go? Well, it turns out you don't have to move the queen yet. You can go knight d or a to c5. In the game, Gukesh, he finds the wrong knight. He moves the knight on the A file to c5, knight A takes c5, but it turns out knight D takes c5 was actually the stronger move, as that knight on a6 would be perfectly placed, bolstering the other knight on c5. Now the knight on d7 is a little bit clumsy and is not doing a whole lot. All right, rook c1, putting more pressure on that knight, and here Gukesh, he's got to think about moves like bishop d5 and b4, but instead he plays yet another dubious move, bishop b3, putting pressure on the queen, but of course, the queen was not very well placed on d1. That means after queen to e1, the queen is better placed. It's eyeing the f2 square, where it would put more pressure on the pinned knight on c5. So Gukesh literally giving Ding Liren a free tempo with this wasted move, bishop b3. Now Gukesh does go bishop e6, once again retreating, but even this was a mistake. Now here, Ding Liren, queen to f2, piling up that pressure on that knight on c5, and oh, how fast the tables have turned. I mean, just a few moves prior, Gukesh had a massive advantage being up a pawn, but now Ding Liren, after this wasted move, bishop b3 by Gukesh, he is suddenly on the verge of winning this knight on c5 or winning the exchange, something like that. All right, Gukesh, he tries to defend, rook to c8, but now a very strong move by Ding, bishop to e3, the retreating move, the point being, he's freeing up that d4 square for the knight. Knight to d4 is coming next. Things are getting very dangerous for Gukesh. All right, rook c7, trying to defend, but then knight d4, sure enough, hitting the bishop. The bishop must move, bishop f7, and now Ding, he just jumps in with the knight. Knight to c6. That knight is simply a monster on the c6 square, and very importantly, it is cutting off the defense of the rook to the knight on c5. Therefore, bishop takes c5 is simply the threat here, winning that knight, or rook takes c5, either of those moves. All right, here Gukesh, he plays the only move he can to try and defend. He gives up the rook for the knight, the exchange sacrifice. Rook takes c6, then bishop takes, queen takes, and now we have bishop takes c5, winning back that piece. Now let's slow down and do inventory. A lot of pieces were just traded off. Here, Ding Liren has the queen, the minor piece, and the rook versus the queen and two minor pieces of Gukesh. That means Ding is up the exchange. He has the rook for the extra knight of Gukesh. However, all is not lost for Gukesh. He does have those two protected pass pawns on the queen side. Those pawns are simply insanely powerful, and he's got the very simple plan of pushing his pawns down the board, especially the passed A pawn. All right, from here, Gukesh, it is his turn to move. He starts with the move h6, giving his king a little extra loft on the king side. He can go to h7 if he needs it in the future. Now Ding, he does the same, king to e1, centralizing his king. Then Gukesh, b4, the start of the pawn march down the board. Now here, Ding, his best move is just king to d2, believe it or not, continuing to centralize his king. If we go into an endgame, the king will be having access to the queen side, where it can defend against those passed pawns on b4 and a5. Now, instead of that, he does go queen d4, centralizing his queen. Optically, a very good move, but it turns out to be quite a bit weaker than king d2. All right, Gukesh, it continues. Knight d5, centralizing his knight being supported by that Ben Finegold pawn on f6, that pawn being incredibly useful so far in this game. All right, Ding, now he does go king d2, very good, and Gukesh, queen to g2, flying down on the king side with the queen, and now both sides do a little bit of a dance with their queens. Queen to f2, then queen d5, then queen d4, then queen g2. Now here, Ding Liren, he's basically offering Gukesh a draw. He goes queen f2, queen d5, queen d4, and here Gukesh, if he wants it, he can just go queen g2. That would be literally the third time in a row that position has been achieved. That would be a draw on the spot. That is why the eval bar on the left side of your screen is collapsing, literally one move away from a draw. But Gukesh, he's a fighter. He doesn't go for it. Instead, he plays a much weaker move. That is the move queen to a2. Gukesh here, he knows he had the draw. He knows he's a little bit worse. He wants to play on for a win. All right, here, Ding Liren, rook c2, hits the queen. Queen to e6, retreats the queen, and now Ding Liren. Here he does go queen d8, hitting the king on the g8 square. Now king to h7 is virtually forced, and now queen takes a5, that being the point of queen d8, hitting both the king and that pawn on the a5 square. Now here, Gukesh, he's got a counterattack on the queen side, and he's got to do it fast. He goes b3, pushing that pawn down the board. the rook is forced back, rook to c1, and then queen d5, flying in with the queen. Now, of course, this is a very dangerous move. Here, Gukesh is threatening ideas like knight to f3, as that pawn on e2 would be pinned to the king by the queen. So here, Gukesh, he's got some very dangerous attacking ideas coming up. So with that in mind, Ding Liren, he's got to find the right way to proceed. Well, if Ding wanted to play for a win, bishop d6 would be the way to play on, putting pressure on that knight on e5 immediately. Then the main line goes b2, queen takes, and then sure enough, knight to f3, hitting the king, and again, that pawn on e2 is pinned. From there, Ding would have a very small advantage. He may be playing for a win, but instead here, Ding, he bails out to an endgame immediately with the move queen to e4 check, hitting both the king and the queen. Of course, if you move the king, say king g8, you lose the queen on g2. Therefore, queen takes e4 is forced by Gukesh. Now we have d takes e4, and here Gukesh, he's in a very critical position. He's got to find a series of very precise moves to equalize in the endgame. If he doesn't find literally the exact right moves, he will lose on the spot, as white just has too much material. He is still up the exchange. He has the extra rook versus the knight of Gukesh. And if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Gukesh in this position. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. All right, here, of course, Gukesh, he finds the series of moves. First, b2, hitting the rook. Now, the only way to stop that pawn is going to be rook b1. That is what's played, rook b1. But then bishop a2 hits the rook on b1. You're giving up the pawn on b2 because if you take it, rook takes b2 played in the game. Of course, if you don't do that, if you move the rook, then b1 will promote to a queen and you lose the rook for almost nothing. Therefore, rook takes b2 is forced. But now the key idea by Gukesh, knight to c4, hitting both the rook and the king on the d2 square. The king moves, then you take the rook, and here, both players do agree to a draw. The point being, after king takes b2, here Gukesh can just go say bishop e6, and suddenly we have a bishops of opposite color endgame with pawns on one side of the board. That is going to be literally a draw. There is no way for either side to play for a win. Black's going to be able to get a blockade on the light squares. There's nothing Ding can do despite being up a pawn. So therefore, for that reason, in this position right here, both players do agree to a draw, a very well-deserved draw, and an absolutely crazy game in round number 8 of the World Chess Championships between Ding Liren and Gukesh. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button. And check out this video right here, where I cover round number 7 of the World Chess Championship. That game was almost as good as this one. If you haven't seen my analysis of that game, I highly recommend checking it out. That game was unbelievable. And I'll see you in the next video.